Hi, folks. So this is um, a lecture course for Lecture Exam 4. Previously, we took a look at something really big in zoology, and that is color. And now we're taking a look at the impact of size. And it turns out that size really does matter in zoology. It also matters in plant biology. It matters in all of life. And it's simply, so I'll give you sort of the big end point, take home point after all of this content that we're about to discuss. The bottom line is, if you take a little animal like an ant and you enlarge it to the size of about a person, keeping all the proportions so that when it's really big, about the size of a person, it looks like the same ant, but just really big. If you do that, it turns out that there are tremendous differences in the properties of the organism, and it turns out its ability to function is greatly affected. So, unlike what you'll see in movies, whatever monster movie you saw where there's some really big whatever it is, frogs or ants or leeches or whatever really, really big thing it is, they usually just show a big version of it. In fact, when I was a kid, there were some movies, really low budget movies, where they would make little model structures like you could put on your desk of a city. And then to have a monster, they'd run a lizard, actually have it run through this little model, the city, and they'd slow it down because the lizard would move too fast. And so their idea of a monster in a city was just a lizard scaled, with this scale model of a city there. It was really pretty silly. It looked a lot like a lizard running around in a Lego set. In any case, maybe they've gotten better, but they still seem to assume that if you just take a little thing and make it a big thing, it would still function much the same. And that's not true. So we're going to spend a good amount of time going through and thinking about different aspects of the importance of size. So how about this for a starter? What I want to consider to begin with is the idea that when we think of a certain animal, whatever the animal is, do they tend to be about the same size wherever you find them? Now remember that wherever we find animals naturally is regarded as that animal's range. The range of an animal, the range of a plant, is where on earth do we find these naturally. So when we think about beavers, do we have beavers in Florida? Yeah, we do. Do we have beavers in Canada? Sure. Do we have beavers in Alaska? Absolutely. Yeah. Are those beavers all pretty much the same kind of beaver? No. No, and that's what we want to talk about. And by the way, why are we talking about beavers? Because this is Blackburn College, okay? So whenever possible in a zoology class, I think that I should be talking about beavers. So there's cute little beaver. Of course, we have them all around here. There's some beavers having some fun. Beavers, as I think most of you know, are going to gnaw down all kinds of plants, small trees, large trees, and they're going to assemble them in some way to make a dam. And so they're going to dam up a stream and make a pool where they're able to have a home and a lodge and make a better living with these pools. Because they seem to be working so hard all the time, that's why I think we adopted beavers as the Blackburn College model. All right, so are beavers bigger in Canada? You betcha. Here's a diagram that I thought was pretty useful. And on the right over here, I think you can see my pointer, that little diagram on the right generally shows you the range of size from the small beavers that they have in Florida. And if you ever get down to Florida, I wouldn't bring it up because they're probably sensitive about the fact that they have just little beavers, as compared to Illinois, which has much bigger beavers, as compared to Canada, which has these great big beasts. And in the past, by the way, there had been even much bigger beavers, but we don't have those species alive anymore. Here's the range map for beavers. You can see that beavers make their way down into the Florida panhandle. They make their way all the way down into the southern parts of Texas. And then you can see the range goes up through Canada into Alaska. As the climate is warming, and you know that it's warming faster towards the poles, so in this most northern parts of Canada, where we see the northern extent of the range of beavers, that range is extending further north. And I read some studies about what's going on. It's pretty interesting, actually. It turns out you might think of it in a bit of a positive way. As the beavers are extending their range, they're going into places where normally there weren't beavers, and they're going to block up a stream and create little ponds in areas of Canada and Alaska where there weren't little ponds. And once you create little ponds, then there's all sorts of plants and other kinds of critters that start using these ponds. And so it's attracting other wildlife and extending the range of other kinds of wildlife and other kinds of organisms, because now they're making these kinds of ponds. All right. Here's a general principle in zoology called Bergmann's rule, and Bergmann's rule is simply this, that endotherms tend to be larger in colder environments. And so for us in North America, what that means is as you go farther north, whatever mammal you have, it's probably going to be bigger. Now remember that we are endotherms. Go back and remember the difference between endotherms and ectotherms. Endotherms make their own heat, and that's why on a cold day you might wear a sweater, and that sweater does not produce heat. What that sweater does is helps to hold in the heat that you generate inside your own body. So we clearly make our own heat. Ectotherms, like a frog, maybe a bullfrog right now at the edge of a pond, is largely being kept warm by the temperature of the water or by the sun that might be coming out during the daytime. Now what we want to consider is why. I mean, that's really what a science class at college should be asking. Why do we think this is? Bergmann's rule is a description. What we're looking for is an explanation. Well, it turns out not only are animals bigger as you go to colder environments, which normally means farther north, but it might also mean as you go up a mountain. So it's still within the state of Colorado, we could predict that some critters would be larger when you go up the mountain. There are all sorts of exceptions to this, by the way. Well, when you take a look at these bigger beavers, you notice that big beavers have little ears. How about polar bears? Polar bears are pretty big too, but they have little ears. How about this? Now we look at a warm environment and look at the size of the ears on this rabbit. Maybe its friends made fun of it. We hope not. In fact, most of its friends would have had really, really big ears too. Because these critters are adapted to a very warm environment, also an environment that doesn't have as many places to hide as in the area where we live in Illinois. And in these desert environments, these animals get overheated during the day. Now they need that winter, or that warm coat, that fur coat, during the cold nights that you have in a desert. Don't know if you know that, but deserts tend to get very cold at night. And these rabbits, when they get overheated during the day, as you can see over here, have blood vessels that are going through these ears, and these blood vessels dilate, they get bigger, and they carry more of the blood up to the ears, where this animal during the day when it's really hot can get rid of some of the heat. Now, some of you may have remembered this lesson as it relates to elephants. In elephants, one way that you can distinguish between Asian elephants and African elephants is that African elephants, which live in warmer environments, have much bigger ears, which they do much the same as we have right here in this desert rabbit. Might be a hare. In these critters as well, just like the elephants, they're going to have that extra blood to dump heat during the daytime when it's warm. You could predict that at night when it's cold, that these blood vessels will constrict down and the blood flow will be much less in the ears when it's cold at night and they're trying to conserve heat. African elephants are known to flap their ears during a very hot day to actually move air past the blood vessels that are in the ears. I don't know if these animals twitch their ears or do anything like that. Maybe they run and that's enough. Now we take a look at a winter-adapted rabbit, a hare. This one's distinctly a hare. And here you can see that in this cold-adapted rabbit, or hare, they have very short ears. So that brings us then to Allen's rule. Allen's rule is that in these colder environments, the critters have smaller appendages. Again, why? And that's what we want to explore. But just want to review here to make sure. In colder environments, are the animals generally a bigger version or a smaller version? And bigger is the answer. How about the size of the ears? In cold environments, are the size of the ears bigger or smaller? Bigger or smaller? The answer? Smaller. So polar bears are big, but they have little ears. And by the way, this is just one of those things in the English language. It's just fun to look at. It's bears, but it's not airs. It's not beers and ears. Here we have E-A-R-S, and it's pronounced exactly two different ways. Bears, ears. It's not airs and bears. Okay, I go on, but I like to look at these things. So here was what I was leading to. We have Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule, and the question is, why? For that, to understand polar bears, why are they big, and why do they have little ears, we're going to have to do a little bit of math. Now, this isn't tough math. This is the kind of math you did in 5th grade, okay? It's just basic proportions. It's a little real basic geometry. No kidding, I think most of you would have been way past this math in 7th grade, okay? We have to consider surface to volume ratios. It's just figure out the surface area, figure out the volume, and compare the two, okay? And we're going to relate that to size. And what we're going to see is that as anything gets bigger, so you have a little version of it, then you have a big version of it. You got a little ball, now you got a great big ball. You have a baseball, right? And you have a basketball. As anything gets bigger, the surface area does not increase as fast as the volume. So if you compared a baseball to a basketball, baseballs have more surface area for their volume than does a basketball. Okay, that's what we're going to explore. Now, normally when I do this, I use dice. I'm kind of famous for that because I have a bag of dice, and you might remember the dice when we did the experiment on blowing on the dice and being lucky or not. And so I normally drag those dice out, and if you happen to have 8 dice around, it would actually be useful for you to pause the film right now and go get your dice. So I'll wait for you while you go get some dice. I'll enjoy a beverage. Okay, are you back? Did you get the dice? If you didn't, okay, fine. I'll show you some diagrams. It'll probably suffice. Here's a cube. And we're going to assume that the height and the width and the depth, right? So the height, the width, and the depth of the cube are all the same. That's what makes it a cube, right? We could say that E here, the length of one side is an inch. And so if that'll help you, we'll make it an inch. And so if you just remember basics of how do you determine the volume, it's height and width times depth, right? And so a single dice, if it was a really big dice, 1 inch on the side, it's 1 by 1 by 1, that's 1 cubic inch, if that was the case. Okay. What's the surface area? Well, surface area is what's the area of one side times 6. Okay, the area of one side is going to be 1 by 1, so that's going to be 1 square inch. And there are 6 sides to a cube. Yeah, right? In fact, you know that because if you think about those dice, the numbers run from 1 to 6 because there's 6 sides. So you roll a dice, and the question is what side is up, and it's a 1 in 6 chance. That's what we already worked through when we were trying to see if we could be lucky by blowing on dice, right? So, one side, 1 by 1, got 6 of them or so. 6 times 1 square inch, 6 units squared. So we've calculated the surface area, we've calculated the volume, and now we can generate a surface to volume ratio. Well, that's 6 over 1. Not too tough. Okay? So let's remember that. Now here's why I wanted you to have 8 dice. Because we're going to increase the side of the cube. We're going to double it. So it's 2 by 2 by 2 instead of 1 by 1 by 1. Now 1 by 1 by 1 would be one of these dice or cubes down here. But if you want to make a cube of side 2, well look, you got to have 1, 2 here for the width, 1, 2 here for the height, and 1, 2 here for the depth. And so that's 2 by 2 by 2, that's 8. You can just see, guys, if there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there'll be another one back there, 8. All right, so if you want to make the cube now side 2, you're going to need 8 dice. All right, so what we need to do right now is now that we've made this bigger, let's again calculate the surface to volume ratio. And before, the surface to volume ratio was 6 to 1. Well, now that this thing's bigger, let's see if that ratio is the same. So, what's the surface area? Well, one side is clearly 4 square inches. There's 1 square inch. You can count them. 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's one side. And then there's 6 sides. So if one side is 4 times 6, we'd have 24 square inches on the collective sides of this cube. What's the volume? Well, we have 8 dice, guys. One dice was 1 cubic inch, and now we got 8 of them. So it's 8. But we can do the math. 2 by 2 by 2. 2 width, 2 height, 2 depth. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 more, 8. There you go. The volume's 8. Surface area, we said, was that 4 on one side times 6, so that's 24. So what is our surface to volume ratio? The answer is it's 3 to 1. We went from 6 to 1 to 3 to 1. And now you're starting to see the point. We took a single cube and now we doubled it in all of its dimensions. And clearly we went from 1 dice to 8 dice, so that's clearly increased the volume by 8 times. You can see that right there, right? 8 cubic units. We have 8 dice, so we have 8 times the volume. So, right, this cube would weigh 8 times as much as 1 cube. Okay. But when we look at the surface area is no longer 6 to 1. Instead, the surface area is 3 to 1. Well, let's do this once more. Let's take a look, and here it happens to be a Rubik's Cube. That's handy. It's 3 by 3 by 3, right? So there's the height, there's the width, and there's the depth. So we can do this again. If this was a cube of dice, how many dice would we need? Well, one layer right here clearly has 9 dice, and there's 3 layers right here. So if it takes 9 for that layer, and 9 here, 9 here, that's 27. So we'd need 27 dice to do this. And that's something I usually show the students on that front table. And just so you can imagine, I sometimes get the 27 dice all stacked up this way, and then I bump it, and then they fall on the floor. And so I could spend the next 10 minutes showing you what it would really be like if I'm in lecture, where then some people in the front rows have to pick up the dice, and they give them back to me, then I have to make the cube. Okay, nonetheless, we can go a little faster. So we have a cube now of 27 cubic units. Okay, what's the surface area? Well, clearly you can see that there's 9 faces on one side, and that is 3 times 3, right? That's the math, but you can see it. You don't have to do the calculations. It's right here. There's 9 on one side. There's 6 sides. So 6 times 9, I hope you remember, is 54. So now what's our surface to volume ratio? Well, 54 over 27 reduces to 2 to 1. All right, so now let's put this all together. When the side was 1, when we had just 1 dice, the surface to volume ratio was 6 to 1. When the side was 2, we had, if you remember, a total of 8 dice. The ratio was 3 to 1. And now, just now, when we looked at the Rubik's Cube, when there's 3 on each side of the cube, the ratio becomes 2 to 1. So clearly, as our cubes were getting bigger, side of 1, side of 2, side of 3, as this cube increased then in size, in mass, in volume, as it got bigger, look how the surface area did not increase as fast. The ratio, and this is the whole point, the ratio of the surface area to the volume went down. And here's the point. As any object gets bigger, keeping all the same proportions, how does its surface to volume ratio change? And the answer is it decreases. Bergmann's rule. Why is it that endotherms tend to be larger in colder environments? Because as a beaver gets bigger, it has proportionately the ratio of surface area to volume goes down. So, if an endotherm loses heat through its surface, if you're really, really big, you have proportionately less surface area for the volume. So, an endotherm in a larger environment doesn't lose as much heat proportionally as a little thing. Here's simply the written summary. So now let's look now at some examples of things where the truth is you sort of already know this, but you didn't maybe do the calculations. Larger objects take longer to cool than small objects. I don't know if you know this. It has to do with when I cook food and then I'm waiting for it to be cool enough to be able to eat. Okay? So if I grab a great big bowl of soup, it's not going to cool off as fast as little peas or little things of corn that I have on my plate. I can spread peas and corn on my dinner plate and kind of blow on them and they cool off rather quickly. But that bowl of soup, oh my goodness, that's going to cool very, very slowly. Here's an example of something that I do regularly in the wintertime. I don't know if any of you make pudding, but when I make pudding, darn it, I like the old-fashioned cooked pudding. I don't like the texture or the flavor of instant puddings. So I cook pudding. And the standard pudding box is requiring 2 cups of milk. So the size is 2 cups. And so you microwave the milk and stuff, mix up the pudding. And then I really want to eat that pudding, right? That's why I made it. And it's going to be too hot because you got to bring it nearly to a boil, okay? So if I want to cook my pudding, and then I want to eat it soon, should I leave it in the bowl with 2 cups together in the bowl, right here, or should I divide up my 2 cups of pudding into 4 little separate containers? So 4 1/2 cups, right? 4 times a half is 2, or keep it all together. In which of these situations will the pudding cool off faster? Which one, whether it's in the big bowl or these little cups, will it cool off faster? And I think that you know it's going to be over here. And that's certainly what I do. Okay. We don't have hands raised. You can raise your hand right now, but I'm probably not going to see it. It'd be kind of weird if you came over to my house and were watching all these lectures on my computer. Kind of funny. All right, let's think about another way that all this applies. We want to cook potatoes. I don't know if you've been involved in cooking potatoes before, but these are regular white potatoes. You probably are going to peel them first. And then if you want to make mashed potatoes, you're going to cook them. And when you cook them, you'll probably boil them. You might steam them, but you could boil them. Now, what situation will make them cook faster? When you cut them up, right over here, although the skin's still on these, or if you leave them whole. And I think most of you know when you're cooking potatoes, you cut them up. Now, when you cut them up, interestingly, just a little cooking tip for you, we cut them up so that the pieces are all about the same size, and that's so that they all cook at about the same rate. If you had little ones, little pieces, and big pieces, which do you think would cook faster, the little pieces or the big pieces? Which one would cook faster, the little ones or the big ones? And again, you can raise your hand and you can shout out the answer. Feel free, everyone can shout out the answer. And the answer is the little pieces are going to cook faster. So if you had little pieces and big pieces and you cooked it, and you didn't cook it till the big pieces were completely done and made mashed potatoes, you'd have chunky, lumpy mashed potatoes. That's not acceptable at our house. So what are we going to do? Cut up potatoes or have uncut? Again, you can raise your hands, A or B, and we said B. The cut up potatoes are going to cook faster. Okay. Here's another thing you know, and I wish I was there in person for you. Because what I need you to do right now at your own seat, and if you actually do this, it'll be more meaningful for you. Think about you've gone outside, you don't have any gloves or mittens or anything on, and it's freezing cold. What are you going to do with your hands when it's freezing cold? Well, you'll probably make your hands into fists. You might also press your hands next to your body. And in both cases, you're reducing the surface area of your hands. Now, a little experiment we're going to do here, and the good news is you don't need to cut any fingers off of your hand. Leave all your fingers attached to your hand, okay? Now, I want you to spread your hand out, spread your fingers out on your hand, and then make a fist. In which situation your fingers spread, or a clenched fist, was there more skin exposed? And there clearly was more skin exposed if you had your fingers spread out. When you made a fist, you put a lot of that skin next to other skin. Your fingers are together. By having less skin exposed, this conserves heat. And that's why keeping your fingers together is a way to conserve heat on a cold day. Well, that's the principle behind mittens. Instead of having gloves with your fingers all spread out, each one insulated, in fact, mittens are much more effective because it keeps all of your fingers together. Actually, if you're up in Alaska, you'll see that in really cold environments, if you do research down in Antarctica and whatever, people regularly have mittens on. They may have a kind of a mitten that people use, I think, sometimes when they're hunting, that has the thumb free and also has the index finger free, and the other 3 fingers here are clustered together. And that might allow you to to do more things like pinch things and pick up things. And here, in the case of hunting, it allows you to pull the trigger on whatever firearm you're using. Here's another way to think about this service to volume ratio. So, sometimes people invite me to weddings, and in some occasions, what I've done is decided to give them Blackburn branded gifts. So I might provide for you, if you've invited me to your wedding, 8 Blackburn College mugs. And those mugs might be in a box. Each one may be in their own little box. And so I could look really generous and I could wrap up each one of those boxes. And what the heck, I have 8 presents for you. Or I might just try to save some time and energy and wrap them all collectively together. Now I hope you remember that 8 cubes makes a big cube, right? A cube with 2 sides. The question I have for you, and here's the scenario, do I wrap all those 8 boxes with mugs in them? Do I wrap them as one collective, cube, or do I wrap them separately? And here's my point. If I wrap them separately or I wrap them together, in which case do I need more wrapping paper? And this principle, by the way, believe it or not, will have to do with where you might want to get an apartment in an apartment building. So which one of these cases, the great big cube or the 8 little cubes, has more paper, more wrapping paper? So wrapping them separately like this. Clearly this requires more wrapping paper. Now, maybe you're puzzled, maybe this automatically makes sense. I've been teaching this now for, I've taught zoology about 35 times. And throughout this, there's probably about half the class that sort of sees this right away and this isn't a big stumbling block. And then there's about 20% of the class that struggles. And so that's why I'm going to all this time and energy. If you don't see this right away, that this requires more wrapping paper, look at it this way. If I wrapped each one of these and then I pushed it together into that great big cube, where would I have 2 cubes touching? Well, I'd have these 2 cubes touching there, these 2 cubes touching here, these 2 cubes touching, right? That surface would be pushed against this one. Wherever I would have 2 cubes touching, I wouldn't need to wrap that surface, would I? Where I have 2 cubes coming together, I wouldn't need any wrapping paper there because you wouldn't see that. And that's how you reduce exposed area by being bigger. You have less surface area, so maybe that works for you. Imagine that here we've got the 8 here. Any place where one box touches another on the inside of the cube, you don't have to wrap it. And so that shows you here there's less surface area exposed. Here there's more surface area exposed just by taking the same volume and cutting it up. So we're back to this. Why do Canadian beavers have tiny ears? Why do polar bears have tiny ears? And here's the answer: to conserve heat. What they're doing is having small ears that are not going to lose very much heat. Now think about those great big African elephants, and those African elephants were in fact losing an awful lot of heat, right? Not sure if I just moved everything out of the screen. So, why did we see the big ears in these rabbits? Because they're losing heat. Why do we have little ears here? It's less surface area, and so they're conserving heat. Okay. So, how do surface to volume ratios relate to even a desperate situation like you might be losing your life, literally, in a real tough situation? And the answer is huddling. So here's some little baby penguins, and what they're doing is huddling. Yeah, by huddling, they're reducing their surface area that's exposed. Where else do we see surface to volume ratios and heat loss? Well, it has to do with people. So one of the things maybe you know or maybe you don't know is that when we bring babies home from hospitals, even if it's the summertime, we tend to put a little stocking cap on their heads and we bundle them up, swaddle them. Okay? So you learn really quickly how to do this. When you're a parent, you put the baby on the blanket, you fold the left side over, the right side over, and then you pull the bottom up. Actually, that's not it at all. You pull maybe the left side over, then the bottom comes up, then the other side over. Boy, it's been a while. Well, when you take a look at this mom and child, one of the things that might come to mind is it looks like either a mom's going to be cold or the baby's going to be too warm. But the difference in how they're snuggled into either, as in the baby's case, some container here, some insulating container, they're snuggled there, but the woman is not as snuggled up. She looks more exposed. Why is it that she's not cold? Well, she's much larger, and so she can't lose heat so quickly, but the baby can. They have radically different surface to volume ratios. Interestingly, we have two kinds of fat in our body. We have white fat, which is the kind of fat that pads our skin and might be gathered around your belly or some other place. And brown fat is a special type of fat that generates heat. It's a way to make heat. And we tend to see brown fat in infants. And we think that's an adaptation to produce heat on the little size of people. Baby rats, baby mice have brown fat to compensate for their really high surface to volume ratios. Now, go back and remember when we were talking about gigantothermy. We said that animals, some of the largest terrestrial animals ever, couldn't cool off enough during the daytime or the nighttime to significantly change the body temperature. And that's because on these great big sauropod dinosaurs, they have such a low surface to volume ratio compared to a person that they didn't have a body temperature that fluctuated much. So we said they were essentially homeotherms. They had steady body temperatures and didn't really have to work at it to regulate the temperature over here as we do. So another place that we see surface to volume ratios that really matter is not when we're exchanging heat, but sometimes when we're exchanging other things. The environment and the bodies might be exchanging, for example, look at water and gases and nutrients that are brought up by the root system of a tree. So what's going on here? Why isn't there simply one big massive root here instead of all this tangled mess? Well, this is much greater surface area for this root system that does lots of things, but it's surface area for absorption. It's also good surface area for grip. It allows these roots to be well nestled into the soil and grip the soil very, very thoroughly. Here's another place where high surface to volume ratios help in the exchange. This is one of the Blackburn College floaters that my students and I discovered. We discovered it in about 2005, and by 2009 we were able to describe a new trait seen in axolotl salamanders. In this case, these guys fill up their lungs, and they fill it up, and then they hold their breath, and that makes them float upside down. And when they do float upside down and they aren't breathing, they get oxygen instead through these big fluffy gills. These gills are actually able to grow larger for even greater gas exchange. Here's one of those floaters when he finally was put in a situation where he could get down into the water and not float anymore. So highly branched gills are another example of an adaptation to increase the surface to volume ratio. Another place that we see this, again, an exchange between an organism and their environment, is in our lungs. Here in our lungs, we have great subdivisions ending in these alveoli, these little bitty sacs. And notice it's not one great big sac, but it's lots of little bitty sacs. And having all these compartments greatly increases the surface area compared to one big sac. Okay, so here's some diseased lungs in which those subdivisions have broken down. There's less surface area here. And so this person, my father was in this situation, they have to work harder to be able to get the oxygen in and the CO2 out of their body. So highly branched lungs increases the surface to volume ratio. Here's another place. Here we're looking at villi that we find in the little finger-like projections on the inside of the small intestine. Each of these little hexagons is representing a single cell. Turns out that these single cells also have thousands of little projections called microvilli. So this is one villus right here. There's a bunch of villi like fingers, and then the cells are coated with microvilli. This is an area for absorption. And when you think of absorbing, like maybe using a paper towel for absorption, the more surface area there is, the more absorbent it is. The more expensive paper towels that you might buy at Walmart sometimes have fibers in them, and they're fluffy paper towels, and they have lots of surface, and so they're going to absorb a lot of water. So here the inside of your intestines is like a really good paper towel. The kind of very flat, smooth paper towels that we buy commercially, and we have them available, they're usually brown that we have in those big rolls, do not work very well because they don't have a lot of the bumps and the folds that create more surface area. Another place where we see a great increase in surface area is in the feet of geckos. Oh my gosh. So here's maybe what you might see with the naked eye. And now you start putting it under the microscope and you see that there's these ridges that run through the feet. Here you see the ridges. Well, what if you magnify one area of one of those ridges? And that's what we see here. And you see there's these little, it looks like little pads. And then when you zoom in on those, you see that each of those little pads is actually a whole bunch of little bristles here. And then if you zoom in on those, you see that each of those little bristles has a little flat area here. It almost looks like a golf tee. A little flat expanded area here. And so this whole adaptation is for a tremendous amount of surface area in which, as I understand it, when a gecko's clinging to glass, like this one is right here, that it's actually relying on van der Waals forces, which are very weak, but if you have a lot of them, then you have some adhesion. So, recapping. We've seen surface to volume ratios. We compared simply a small sphere to a bigger sphere. I said a baseball to a basketball. And we said when you look at this change here of being bigger, the surface area does not increase as fast as the volume. So here we've got a great increase in volume, but not so much of an increase in the surface area. We said if you take a single object here and you cut it up, that increases the surface area. It doesn't change the volume because you've just cut it up. And so here you've changed the surface to volume ratio. You've increased the surface to volume ratio by cutting up a big thing into little things. And we said that's what you might do with potatoes. If you wanted to boil the potatoes, cook them, and then make mashed potatoes. Then over here, and this is, by the way, the whole diagram is my creation. Over here, we looked at extensions off the body. And so if this is the body of an organism, you might have gills like our axolotl salamanders, or you might have internal subdivisions in the case of lungs. And we also talked about the little microvilli and the intestine. Another way that you can change the surface to volume ratio is to take something that's round and flatten it. When we think of the same volume, but with these different shapes, if you flatten a sphere, conserving all the volume, so it's just like take some clay, roll it into a ball, and then flatten the clay. When you flatten it, it has more surface area. In fact, a sphere is the shape which has the lowest surface to volume ratio. When you flatten something like a flatworm, you increase the surface to volume ratio. So if you go back and remember platyhelminthes and flatworms that we looked at, they didn't have any special respiratory systems. Okay. I didn't mention it, but when you take a bite of food, one of the things that you do in your mouth is chew it. And when you chew it, you break it down into smaller pieces. Those smaller pieces might be easier to swallow, but one of the other things that does is opens up more surface area so that your stomach acids and enzymes in your stomach and small intestine can better access the food. And finally, I said that there's a figure in the book. This is the figure in the book, 33.9 on page 693, that goes through much of what we talked about. I want to look at some other aspects of size, but that'll be the next lecture. See you there.